when Black people were excluded from the New Deal, they were still using our tax money. They were still using the dollars that we earned, right? So that is an investment that we have put into America that we deserve to see some return on.
Today, I'm talking to Michael Harriot, who is a senior writer at The Root, which is an outlet that talks about Black news, politics and opinions, and culture. So Michael Harriot, who's also recently made headlines after writing an article about former presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg, welcome. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just dive right into it. You wrote an article recently called "Can Coronavirus Cure White Supremacy?" And there were some things in that you highlighted that I thought we could get into. And I'll start with taking one of the lines that you said was, "The reaction to this new crisis reveals that we have always been aware that our economy didn't represent all of Americans and was never intended to guarantee prosperity for all." So what about this crisis has revealed those points, that the economy doesn't represent us all and that, it was never intended to be prosperous for all Americans?
Well, there's so many examples of this, but one of the greatest examples is some of the news that's coming out today that Black people are disproportionately being affected by coronavirus. And a lot of people are associating that with lifestyle, because I think it's kind of a malpractice to make that point without saying why they're affected. And a lot of it is because of economic reasons. A report from 2016 says Black people are twice as likely to live in a zip code that doesn't have a hospital or primary care physician. That's economics, right? That stems from the history of redlining. That stems from how we segregated Black neighborhoods throughout American history. You can look at it as, we know that Black people have 1/10 the wealth of white people. For every dollar a white person has, a Black person has a dime. And that affects medical care. When you talk about how COVID-19 affects Black people, you have to realize that a lot of people can't get tested because they don't have the money to get tested. Black people are more likely to be uninsured. All these are economic reasons why this pandemic is affecting Black America at disproportionate rates.
So that said, Detroit is a hotspot for COVID. And in Michigan as a whole, Black Americans make up 14% of the population, account for 33% of the cases, but 40% of deaths. And then you also have Asian Americans who are victims to spikes in racism. And at the same time, you have some people who would say that now is not the time to bring up race or socioeconomics because we should be banding together. And I just would like to know, how do you respond to that? And what is the risk of not addressing these things while they're happening?
Well, I think this virus specifically points to the inane stupidity of that argument, right? Because when you look at it, my argument has always been that, racism doesn't just affect Black people. It affects, the entire American population. And this is a good example, right? So when you talk about the American economy now, if you go back to that article, we talked about how legislators admitted that, when people are out of work, when when businesses are struggling, the economy struggles, right? Which is what I've argued about Black America, right? When you disproportionately underfund our schools, when we are disproportionate, Black unemployment has always been about twice as high as unemployment. It affects the entire American economy. Now you see this being argued when that crisis hits white America. But as it affects this, right, specifically to your question, right, we can't stamp out this disease if we don't address the systematic racism in healthcare in America, because if Black people are getting it at disproportionate rates, then it's not stamped out. If you're on a bus with a Black person that might have it, or if your children attend school, or if you work with a Black person that has it, it affects the entire population. So that shows that, we have to address race if we want to address this pandemic. We just can't treat everyone equally because we know that there's never been anything in the history of America that is as hard to get as this testing is, that costs as much as this testing, and Black people had equal access to it, right? That's never happened. So we have to address those issues to address the COVID-19 pandemic.
So as we witness the federal and state government generate and distribute resources to struggling businesses, communities, families who've lost jobs, and even freelance workers in some cases, now that we've seen this, what are going to be the social ramifications in the future, knowing when people know that this is what our governments are capable of, this is what our tax dollars can do? What does the normal look like after that?
Right. I think, we have to address the disparities by addressing these economic issues overall. So now we know that our government can come up with trillions of dollars out of the air, right? Out of the ether. So we can't argue against things like reparations anymore, right? Like, you can't say that it's too expensive when we just saw what America pulled out of nowhere. When we talk about universal health care, for instance, right? Again, I said that Black people are disproportionately under and uninsured. You can't argue that it would cost the American economy too much when we just saw what that lack of health insurance and what that lack of health care cost the American economy and the American people as a whole. So a lot of these arguments, right, when you talk about Black businesses, the argument has been you can't disproportionately target Black businesses to help them. And now we're proving that it also helps the economy. If you want to help Black people come out of poverty, you have to address Black businesses. You have to give people, they call it welfare when they gave it to Black people in the 90s, but they called it, farm aid when they give it to Midwest farmers. They call it business opportunities when they give it to corporations. But now we see that all integrates into creating a healthy economy. And now those arguments are null and void because we've seen that they not only have the resources, but are aware at what putting those resources in the right places can do for this country as a whole.
In a lot of your articles, you're never short on providing historical context as well as, the data to back that, right, the points up. So I wonder, are there any points in American history that come to mind that you think might help us predict how all of this might actually play out, or maybe how we could get to a better outcome?
Well, so the perfect example is the New Deal, right? So after the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression that followed, we had to dig ourselves out of a similar, if not worse, economic hole, right? So what did we do? First thing we did is we created the Tax Act of 1935. They called it the Soak the Wealthy tax. So they taxed, the highest margin of taxes was at 70%, was at 90%. For anyone who made over $500,000. And they used those funds to create what we call now the American middle class. They created a federal minimum wage. They created what we call now Social Security. They created the Homeowners Loan Corporation that built what we know now as the suburbs. They mechanized farms. They gave white-owned businesses funds to supplement their income. And now Black people were excluded from the New Deal. That the New Deal was what created redlining. But it really created what we call the middle class for generations to come, right? So those people who moved into those free houses or those who used guaranteed loans that were created for the suburbs, those people became the middle class that we know today. And those people now will tell you, some of them will tell you that, their grandfathers and their grandmothers raised themselves up by their bootstraps and worked hard to get here. But we know that this economy that we live in today, this middle class, it came from taxing, progressive taxing, where they taxed the wealthy and used it to supplement the middle class. Now, over time, the wealthy corporations and the wealthy individuals managed to whittle away at those taxes until we got to where we are today, where the wealthy pay fewer taxes than the middle class, and the top 5% of earners in America make more than the bottom 90%. Right? So that's what this corporatization of wealth has gotten us to, right? But we have the opportunity now to create a new economy, a new middle class where Black and brown people are included. Now we know the solutions. We've just seen them say, hey, if you're poor and you can't make it, we're going to give you money. We just seen that, hey, the only way our economy can be inclusive is to help businesses. We've just seen them say that we have to strengthen the least of the American economy to help the broad coalition of our society. And so we know how to do it. We have the opportunity to do it. We've done it before. There should be nothing stopping us from using that historical example to build a new middle class that's inclusive of all.
So that said, who do you think the responsibility falls on? Because another thing that, at least I've heard is that, it's not necessarily about race. It's about where you live, how hard you worked, like you're saying, the bootstrap example. So who bears the responsibility to, I guess, shepherd that new economy?
We all do. Again, this virus is a perfect example. And in those examples, of hard work, and it reduces the example of American history to its simplest form, right? So we know that for most of our history, Black people and brown people were excluded. So we can't discount that when we're rebuilding. So whose responsibility is it to build this new society? It's the people with the privilege. It's the people who have the money. It's the people who have historically enjoyed the resources and the privilege that whiteness affords, that the middle class has built off the Black backs, not just the backs, not just the labor. We always talk about labor, right? But when Black people were excluded from the New Deal, they were still using our tax money. They were still using the dollars that we earned, right? So that is an investment that we have put into America that we deserve to see some return on. And it is the responsibility of the people who enjoyed the capital that we lent them to build that middle class to return our investment to us.
As this country goes through this pandemic, there are three questions that I was just curious as to what your response in particular would be. So what have you been most disappointed in? What has given you the most hope? And what was the thing that made you say, oh, yeah, of course?
All right. So I guess the most disappointed is that, our government still seems reluctant to do the things that we know are necessary to stop this from happening, right? So I've been disappointed in that politics and partisanship and racism still is playing a part, even during a global pandemic or what they call wartime. And the thing that I guess that gave me hope is that I do see America recognizing the solutions to the problems that we've been worrying about for decades, right? Like we accept now that we're going to have some kind of universal health care. We accept now that we're going to have to give some economic help to the middle and lower class, right? So those things, because in a poverty, in a time of crisis, it exposes what's been wrong with this house that we've built for a long time. We say, you might be able to ignore your leaking roof for years, but when the storm comes and there's a big hole in it, you think, hey man, we got to fix this hole, right? So that's what's given me hope that America might be finally willing to fix that hole. And the thing what was the third question? The thing that surprised me?
What have you seen throughout this pandemic that has made you say, oh, of course that would happen? Or, yeah, of course, someone would do or say something like that?
Right. So I think the thing that surprised me the least was that all the rich people and the celebrities seem to have access to the medical care. That like everybody's wondering, hey, how the whole Golden State Warriors team get tested, and all the representatives get tested, and how did they end up with tests, and how did Tom Hanks get tested? And I can't get a test, and so of course you've seen that economics and wealth affects everything else in society, right? So it's exposing that, and now everyone says, "Oh yeah, of course they got more money, so they'll be healthier than we are."
Like, do you think that's going to change the relationship between celebrity, wealth, prosperity, and privilege that majority of Americans are going to have? Do you think it's going to change majority of Americans' perception?
I don't know if it'll change the perception as much as it'll change our goals, right? So for the longest time, I always use this phrase like, a lot of people, especially poor white people who support like conservative policies, they will say, they've been led to believe that they're not losers, they're winners who haven't won yet. And so this crisis might get us to reflect and think about what winning looks like, right? So does winning look like becoming a millionaire, or does winning look like being able to support my family in a time of crisis? Does it look like being healthy? Does it look like being able to access medical care when I'm sick? Does it look like being able to live in a community where my neighbors don't have to worry about not affording their rent during 1 month of crisis, right? So that's what winning looks like. And the people who thought they were excluded from all of the things that Black and brown people face for so many years, they realize, oh, I'm in that box too, right? That's what we're realizing now, is that this ideology that helps those of privilege also hurts the vast majority of those who've been working alongside those privileged people, right? Like the poor white people, they're hurting just as much as Black people, right? And now they're seeing, oh, these policies that I've been advocating for years, they don't help me. And maybe that's the thing that we'll realize out of this pandemic.
Well, then that leads to one of my two last questions is what are the biggest lessons that you hope we take away as we get to, again, whatever that new normal is going to look like?
What I hope it'll look like is that we see now, like it's as clear as day, that all these economic disparities, all of these racial disparities, all of these educational disparities, it is literally life and death, right? It is not just some ethereal thing that we pontificate about on Twitter, or that we talk about on social media, or that it's some indication of being woke. No, it really is our lives. Like when you live in a red line neighborhood, you might die because you don't have access to medical care. When you work and earn a living that doesn't offer you a living wage, you might die because you can't afford to get testing. And it's not just in this pandemic, it's everyday life for a large group of people. So I hope that's the lesson that we'll learn.
And lastly, what message do you have for Black and brown people of America and America as a whole?
The message that I would say for Black and brown people is like, this is hard. But we've been through this before. Like our hands are weathered by the work that we've done and our ancestors have done and our mothers and our fathers have done. So this is our test for our generation. But we know the previous generations that came before us have passed it, and we can pass it too. And as for America as a whole, my message for them is, now you see how interconnected we all are. You can't just isolate yourself. No man is an island, because the person that is 6 feet away from you is intertwined and inextricably joined to you because we all share the air and the sunlight and this country and the policies that not only gave you what you have today, but they had to take it from someone. And the person that they took it from is breathing the same air you're breathing.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.